I'm Suruti.
And I am Hannah.
And welcome to RedHanded.
And last week we were banned fresh. This week we're fresh, because we've been back for a week. I'm clean, I'm squeaky. We ordered a shit ton of Korean skincare, so I feel like I've just got that CGI baby face from Twilight.
It's delightful. If you don't know what we're talking about, was that on Under the Duvet?
What, Van Fresh?
No.
Oh.
CGI baby face.
That was Under the Duvet.
Yes.
Or was it Halloween Part 2?
Oh, Halloween Part 2. Yes, you're right. I enjoyed the people who had never seen Twilight because I didn't think that it was our prime demographic. But the people who went looking for the CGI baby face and then put it all over Twitter at how horrific it is. And then the number of people who were like, I have to now go watch Twilight to check if this is real. It's real.
That's so funny.
And we've just given Twilight a bunch of views.
Which
apparently.
I don't feel great about, to be honest. I mean, it doesn't make a difference. They've made millions anyway.
Yeah,
but
they don't need our help.
No, when I was at uni, I was writing an essay on the use of mirrors in horror films. Mm-hmm. And I was stuck. And I was like, I can't do something about mirrors that doesn't include vampires. That's ridiculous. But I couldn't find a vampire film. Eventually I used Interview with a Vampire because there's loads of like mirror stuff in there. But I couldn't think of a very specific vampire film where there's enough like content about mirrors to talk about. So I put like on Facebook, because I'm old, I put like a Facebook status and it's like, do they use mirrors in Twilight? And everyone was just like, don't do it. Just don't do it. Don't do it to yourself. Don't do it to us. Don't do it to your tutor. And I didn't, so it was fine.
There you go. I couldn't tell you. I've only seen that one episode. I've only seen that one film.
You've only seen CGI Babyface?
CGI Babyface. Okay. So I randomly just, for some reason, one Christmas it was on, I watched it. I think it was like, I don't know, fucking Breaking Dawn part 1 of part 10 or something. I had no idea what was going on. But that baby's face, scary.
It is pretty scary stuff. It is pretty horrendous. And on the topic of horrendous things, we are taking you once again to Uttar Pradesh.
Can't stay out of UP. This actually, the case that we're going to talk about today, because if you guys have been listening for a while or you've been sort of hip-hopping around the episode, you might remember we did a case on the murder of Arushi Talwar, who was a young girl who was murdered in her own bed. And if the name Uttar Pradesh is sounding familiar, it's because that's where that case happened. In fact, that case happened in Noida, which is basically also where we are today. And also, we've been to Uttar Pradesh one other time, which was when I did the Halloween child sacrifices.
Yeah.
That also happened in UP. Can't stay away. They will not stop giving us murder cases.
No, apparently not. So without further ado, this is going to be about dead children. Do with that information what you will. By the summer of 2006, the residents of Nithari, Delhi, India, knew that something dark was going on. The disappearances had started in 2005, and now there were 9 children missing. And every 3 weeks, like clockwork, another child would vanish. This time, the time we're kicking off with, the time we are talking about first, it was 10-year-old Jyoti Lal. Jyoti, like many children in the area, worked for her family's business. The Lals ran a laundry cart, and on the 20th of June 2006, Jyoti had volunteered to take a delivery to a regular client who lived just a few streets away. But she never came home. Her family were beside themselves, and Jabu, Jyoti's father, went to the house she had gone to that day. And that house was actually not a house at all, it was a bungalow. A bungalow that was named Bungalow D5 in Sector 30, which is some District 9 sounding shit.
Yeah, this is the thing. A lot of Indian cities, a lot of Indian municipalities, they will break everything down sector by sector because they're just so fucking massive and it's the only way to manage it. Also, what I would say is in India, at least from my experience, and obviously in this as well, people call houses bungalows. And actually a bungalow there means like a big house.
Oh.
So, I know, it's weird. So bungalow D5, it's not like a little granny house. Bungalow D5 means it's a fucking massive house.
Okay.
So it is ginormous.
Interesting.
Yeah, I know. Why not?
Topsy-turvy town.
Topsy-turvy. So something to also explain right at the start of this story is that very much like India itself, this is a story of deep inequality. Most places where you'll read about this case, though that's not many at all because this case got hardly any coverage compared to cases like that of Arushi Talwar, considering especially how many children get murdered in this story. Nithari is in Sector 31, and this is where Jyoti and all of the missing children in today's story lived. And Nithari is kindly, I think, or maybe very PC-ly, called in many places a semi-rural urban village. I've not come across that term before until I started this research.
Urban village is quite the...
It's a slum. That's what it is. It's a shanty town. It's a slum. Like, people are calling it a semi-rural urban village to be, like, sanitized about it, which, okay, fine. But what you're really doing there is pretending that it is not a part of the city that no one gives a fuck about, where people are living in absolute poverty.
Right.
It's a slum. They'll call it a village. That's not what it is. So Sector 31 is what I would call a slum. And then Sector 30, right next to it, like literally back to back, is where Bungalow D5 is, which is a very nice part of town. And this is very typical in lots of Indian cities. It's not like where you'll have like, oh, the east side is the bad side and the west side is where the nice, like, fancy houses are. There it's like right next door to each other. That inequality is kind of rampant throughout the city, and it's very, very obvious. And the families who live there are some of the poorest people on earth. And not only that, the majority of them are also migrant workers who come from hundreds of miles away, from very rural states like West Bengal and Orissa. And they are also typically Dalits. Dalits in India are beyond oppressed. Hinduism, for those of you who don't know, has a very rigid caste system. And at the top, you have the people who are like historically the priests and things like this. So you don't necessarily still have to be a priest, but your lineage is from that kind of group. Essentially, that's what it's saying.
And is it that the people who can be priests have to be top tier?
Oh, yeah. Basically, if you are from the top, it's a very stratified society. And if you are from that top strata, only you can be priests.
Okay.
But you don't have to be.
Okay.
You don't have to be. But it's historically, that's what your ancestry would have been.
It's an option.
It's an option, and only an option for you. Society is very, very sort of rigidly broken down in this way. So all the way from the priests down to the labourers at the very bottom. And typically in India, you can tell someone's caste by their surname, but also in places people just know. They know what your family is. Everyone knows who you are, what you are. It's something that is very ingrained in Indian, not Indian society, in Hindu society. Mm-hmm. Because India for the longest time was actually, for as long as it's existed as a country, has been, up until quite recently, unfortunately, quite a secular society. Mm-hmm. Now, I wish I could say the same. It's not. We're seeing the rise of the Hindu right in very aggressive terms. But yes, within Hinduism, this is a core part of the belief system. I used to spend every summer with my grandma, who was a very orthodox Hindu woman. And the belief system behind why there is a caste system is reincarnation. So the idea for many Hindus, and I can only speak from my experience, is that people who are on the lower rungs of the caste system are there because they've done something wrong. It's all about karma. It's all about your place in society as decided by God.
So therefore, it's okay for me to treat you like shit because you put yourself there.
Precisely. It's a very handy, baked-in idea for why the caste system is okay, essentially. Yeah. And I'm going to say it because I'm Indian. I was born there. I grew up there for a while. I went there every single summer. For a homogeneous country, for how it looks from the outside in terms of race, it is a very bigoted country. I would say it's far more racist than the West. Just to think that a country is homogeneous and there isn't inequality or racism or bigotry is fundamentally flawed. And the Dalits, unfortunately, sit right at the bottom of that. And Dalits are also so low on the pecking order that they used to be called the untouchables. That is the literal phrase that they were called. And the reason is because they kind of do the lowest jobs in society as far as people are concerned. And so they're impure in every sense. And it's horrific. It's horrific. I mean, if you can think of these people as being subhuman, that's what typically, historically, they've been thought of. And although it may be improving slightly, it's not improved that much. And it's the worst in rural India, like absolutely the worst in rural India. In rural India, men from upper castes can rape Dalit women. Nothing will happen. Nothing will be done to them. I mean, if you just Google Dalit now and then hit the news tab, you will see hundreds and hundreds of cases just pop up like I did when I did this yesterday. Dalit men will be murdered just for disrespecting upper caste men. Like that can just be done and nobody cares. Nothing will happen. It's horrendous. It's horrendous. There's no other word for it. And these days, like I said, with Modi in charge and the rise of the Hindu right, particularly in the north, I would say this is a bigger issue there. Dalits, are just being killed, like I said, for eating beef. And while India booms, the Dalits are still very much ostracised from many parts of society.
Often, Dalits work as labourers and farmhands, but as agriculture in India has hit turmoil in recent years, more and more people have been forced to become migrant workers and move to cities to try and earn a living. But this brings with it another huge problem for the community. According to Mohammed Aftab, a child protection expert with Save the Children, there is a direct link between migration, agrarian neglect, the drying up of rural livelihoods, and the increased incidence of disguised, in air quotes, child trafficking in India. As he puts it, the amount of displacement that has taken place in India in the last 15 years has never happened in human history. And this has led to a huge rise in children, particularly Dalit children, being trafficked. And in fact, child trafficking in India is currently at epidemic levels. Estimates place the number of children who vanish in 1 year to be around 30,000 to 50,000. And the reasons why they're being trafficked are depressing and varied in equal measure. Organ trafficking, forced begging, forced marriage, being used as drug mules. But of course, 96% of children in India who are trafficked are forced into sex slavery. And another horrific discovery that we've got for you is that there are some men in India who seem to believe that by raping a virgin child they can cure themselves of HIV. And currently, India ranks number 3 in the world for HIV rates.
There was a point in early 2000 where it was number 1 in the world for HIV rates. The last time I looked, it was number 2. I checked again yesterday. It's currently sat at number 3, with South Africa and Mozambique being number 1 and 2. So it is a real epidemic there. The government has, I don't know if the government's done stuff, but I would say actually a lot of the cultural change has been done through film, actually to destigmatize HIV for people to go get help. The problem is there, it's the culture. The culture there is you don't have sex before marriage. You marry somebody and then you have sex with them. And then you don't have sex with anybody else. So if that were true, then you wouldn't be seeing these stats. So people don't want to talk about it because where would that be coming from then? So because it isn't culturally acceptable to go have an affair or to go meet somebody online and have sex with them, sex work is absolutely prevalent in India, highly prevalent, but highly secretive. Because people aren't educated about sex, because you don't talk about it, then you have unprotected sex and you end up the number 3 rate of HIV in the world. And nobody talks about it because it's completely taboo subject. And then you smash that together with superstition and beliefs like this, that you can rape a child and get rid of your HIV. And this is what's happening. Hello again.
We're back, and if you already know what we're going to say, shut up, no one asked you. It's British Podcast Awards Listener's Choice. We need your vote. We need your vote more than we have ever needed it before. Please go to British Podcast Awards /vote to place your vote for RedHanded as your favourite show. You don't have to be British. We just have to be, and we are.
And if you take a look at the nominees for the true crime category this year, once again, they are, of course, all mega corporate podcasts from the likes of the BBC, The Times, etc. No shade on them. I'm sure they worked incredibly hard, but we just don't get that recognition in any other category. So the only category we have any chance of winning and forcing everybody to take notice of RedHanded is the listener's choice. And thankfully, it is the only one that you guys can help us with. So please, 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 head on over to britishpodcastawards.com/vote. I'm sure the link will be in the episode description. If not, you can easily find it on the World Wide Webs. Please vote for us, verify that vote in your emails, and enjoy all the bonus content and extra RedHanded that will surely come your way as a result. But for now, let's get back to Nithari. This slum isn't isolated on the outskirts of the city of Delhi. Like we said, it's set back to back with Sector 30, which is a posh and upscale neighbourhood. And between these two parts of town, there was a lane with a water tower that sits menacingly looming overhead. And it was here, around this alley, that the children had all vanished. At bungalow D5, Jubu Lal, who was of course Jyoti's dad, knocked on the door and asked if the residents had seen his daughter.
The man who lived there, a wealthy businessman named Moninder Singh Pundir, said that Jyoti had dropped the clothes off and then she'd left. The Lals searched everywhere for their daughter, but obviously they couldn't go inside the house, and then finally headed to the police station. So many children had disappeared at this point that the Lals and other devastated families begged the police to seal up and search the suspicious alleyway. Police simply told the families, "You keep breeding these kids, and then you lose them, and you come here to waste our time."
The disdain for the Dalit community in India, I know I've been banging on about this, but it cannot be overstated. And whoever was taking these children had found the perfect place to hunt for their prey. A poor, overcrowded slum where children rarely went to school because the parents couldn't afford it. And even if they could afford it, what was the point in sending your child to school? It was better for these families to keep their children at home and have them work in their businesses, like Jyoti was doing with the laundry cart. And also, it's a place where children spend the majority of time unsupervised because their parents are working all the time. And of course, it's a population made up of largely migrant workers from the lowest caste. So you have people who don't care about them, and they have no strong ties to the area that they're in because they're hundreds of miles, often from their own sort of home. And as you go on to see, the police really couldn't have given less of a fuck about these missing kids.
Jubu searched all night for Jyoti, but there was no sign of her. Over the next few months, the Lals used what little money they had to photocopy missing posters and plaster them around the neighbourhood. Jubu followed up on every whisper of a lead, and even went back to bungalow D5 10 times, which is brave shit, oh my god. But Mohinder Singh Pundir and his live-in domestic help, a man named Surrender Kohli, just kept saying that they had absolutely no idea what had happened to Jyoti, and I imagine they did not say that particularly politely.
So after 6 months of searching, Jubu went to a medium to ask for help. And there are 2 documentaries out there that I could find about this case. One is called The Slumdog Cannibal.
Oh, wow.
And the other is called The Karma Killings. Interestingly, The Slumdog Cannibal I hated less.
Oh my god. How?
Because The Karma Killings, I don't know, I'm going to save it for the end because it will give away why I disliked this documentary so much.
Sorry, I'm jumping the gun.
No, I mean, I was actually confused because The Slumdog Cannibal, you can just find it on YouTube. It's free. It's just there. You can watch it. And it looks like it was made quite a while ago. It looks very dated. The Karma Killings was only made a couple of years ago. And it was made for Netflix. And it's incredibly... We'll save it.
Okay.
But basically, in The Karma Killings, if you do go watch it, you can pay... It's like 99p on YouTube because it's not on UK Netflix anymore. And in that, you can watch Jubu go to this medium. And he goes to this medium. She's sat in front of a fire. When he asks her, she starts convulsing and like thrashing around on the floor. The usual shit. She starts speaking in tongues. And then she tells Jubu that Jyoti is dead. And that she's never going to be found. And she also tells him there's no point looking for her anymore. She also says he took her, but she doesn't say who. Jubu's obviously devastated by this news. But he doesn't give up. And over the next 2 years, dozens more children vanished from Nithari. And this is a really heartbreaking part, is that every time a child went missing, Jubu was there to see if there was any connection. But as you'll see, it will take a long time for anything to come out. Then, in late 2006, so the same year that Jyoti went missing, a 22-year-old woman named Payal also disappeared. Payal's father, a man named Nand Lal, went straight to the police. He told them that Payal had gone to work that day and never returned home. And guess where Payal worked as a maid?
Disneyland.
Close. Bungalow D5, Sector 30. And at first, the police wouldn't do anything. They even asked for a picture of Payal. And when her father, Nand Lal, gave them one, the officer took one look at her and said, "Your daughter's pretty, she's probably run off with some guy." Which, in India, again, just to set the cultural context, in India, for a family to be told that your daughter's run off with somebody is like heavy dishonor. It's disgraceful. You know, we've heard this before in Western cases, in the 70s and stuff. They'd just be like, "I was probably just run away," or probably just gone on an adventure. For you to say that about a child in India or a girl in India, the undertones of what you're saying is that she is a girl who lacks morals.
Right.
She is a disrespectful girl.
So it's a double whammy.
And you must be terrible parents to have raised a girl like that.
Jesus.
Who's run off with a guy. So not only is it we're not going to look for your daughter, it's your fault. Because she's a woman of low morals, is what they're saying by this. And also there's a lot of racism you'll see with this, like, because these people come from different states, like the police who are involved in this will constantly say things like, well, obviously it's because you're from there.
Nand Lal had enough. So he told everyone in Nithari where Payal had disappeared. So everyone's eyes are on bungalow D5, apart from the police, obviously. The residents of Nithari had been suspicious of the big white house ever since Jyoti had vanished earlier that year. It was also known to be a house of, air quotes, ill repute. It was well known that there would be raucous parties there, with women coming and going at all hours of the night. And obviously the connotations of a house of ill repute is that those women are sex workers.
Yeah, and this is the thing. If you have a house around here that's just like there's constantly parties going on, you're not going to think much of it. But again, set it within an Indian cultural context that there is a house where there are women coming and going at all hours of the night. That is alarm bells going off for people.
Did you know that my grandma used to live underneath a brothel?
No, I didn't.
So my grandma, Muriel, is 96, so she was like a grown-up in the war. She was in her 20s. And she used to live downstairs from someone that she referred to as a lady of the evening.
Oh, no, you did tell me that actually. Yes.
So there would be visitors coming and going. And then so I think it was like a boarding house situation. So it's just like a room and everyone shares a toilet. Like Dennis Nelson's flat, I would imagine. I don't even know where it was, Blackpool maybe. And one of the patrons came into my grandma's room and pissed out the window.
Wow.
There you go. Yeah, she's full of it, as Muriel.
There you go.
Post-war Britain reference. But enough about Muriel's urine-based trauma. Let's get back to bungalow D5. Bungalow D5 sat slap bang in the 100-metre stretch of road, which had become like the Bermuda Triangle of missing children. The families of those who had vanished also knew that the man who lived there, Maninder Singh Pundir, as you will remember from my excellent pronunciation, was incredibly wealthy and well-connected, and so panic immediately set in, because they strongly suspected, they being Lal and the rest of the people with missing children, strongly suspected that the police wouldn't do anything, even if they found Payal in the house.
And that's the thing, like, when you see the documentaries and they show you the footage of this area, it's basically like you can see Sector 30, you can see Sector 31, and then you can see the sort of lane that connects the two. There's this really scary water tower. And then there's Bungalow D5. It is like a little Bermuda Triangle, or as they describe it in the Karma Killings, a little black hole. That's where all of the children are last seen before they go missing. And Bungalow D5 is slap bang in the middle of it. Like, it is so fucking obvious.
Wow.
So on the 29th of December 2006, the families of the missing children headed straight to Bungalow D5. And what happened next? When I call it an invasion, it's the only word I can use to describe it, because they're fucking sick of it. So the families basically start going through the sewers that ran around the house, and they also climbed over the walls into the garden of this house, and they began digging. Unbelievably, the families found plastic bag after plastic bag filled with bones and even rotten flesh. Bones also littered the water in the drainage system around the house, as well as the drain across the road. And the bones were later discovered to be the remains of small children. There were hands, legs, fingers, and skulls. Inside the house, the police also found sandals, toys, and clothes that had belonged to the missing children. So now not only are they saying, like, the remains are here, and, oh, we don't know how they got there, they find the belongings inside the house. So it really is, I mean, what more do you need? So 52-year-old Maninder Singh Pundir and 36-year-old Surendra Kohli were both arrested. Like we said, Pundir's the guy who owns the house. He's a very wealthy businessman. Kohli is like his domestic help. Not butler, because he's not fancy. He's like...
Manservant.
Manservant, exactly.
Like a chambermaid, but a boy.
But a boy, that's it. They're arrested, and Pundir kept saying that he didn't even know Payal. He didn't even know who she was. But considering that she was a very attractive young woman, even by the police's own comments, and she'd been working at this house as a maid, I find it very hard to believe that Pundir didn't know who she was.
In total, the police claim to have found the remains of 19 victims. 4 of them were women, including Payal, and 15 were children, including, you guessed it, Jyoti. The locals went absolutely mad, and as soon as the men were arrested, the group who had got into the garden of D5 began to smash the house to pieces.
And you can see video footage of this in the Karma Killings and in the Slumdog Cannibal documentary. They've lost it because these people have been ignored by the police for years about this. Their children have gone missing one by one. No one gave a fuck, and this house was there all along. And Jyoti's dad and family are obviously screaming because when they had gone there 10 times to ask these people and they had said no. And Jyoti was in the house the whole time. And they're just throwing bricks, smashing this house to pieces. And I know legally these men haven't been convicted yet, but who can blame them? Not me.
Not only had the discoveries been nightmarish, but there was a real fear that the police would cover up this entire thing because Mahinder Singh Pandit had a lot of political connections and a lot of wealth. And this fear, as you will go on to see, was very real and extremely justified. And obviously you see this in many guises, in many different situations, many different crimes, but it's so stark. And it's so I don't know, it just makes me feel really empty that the Dalits knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that what is about to happen was about to happen. So the local police questioned Pandit and Kohli, and Pandit kept saying that he had no idea about any of it, that it was all news to him, that his garden had been filled with the bones of little children. Kohli was beaten for days. It's important to say at this point, Kohli will go on to do a bit of a deep dive into who he is and where he comes from, but he's also a Dalit. So Kohli is treated very differently by the police than Pandit is. So Kohli is beaten for days. And this isn't just what Kohli says, by the way. It's not just an accusation he makes. The lead investigator of the local police, a man named Vinod Pandey, says in the documentary Karma Killings that he and his team beat and, quote, mentally terrorized Kohli. He says that.
Wow.
Because again, you've got to understand, culturally in India, the police beating the shit out of suspects is common. And they aren't trying to hide it.
It's not something to be ashamed of.
No, it's part and parcel of interrogation. Legally, they're not meant to be doing it, but culturally, it's expected. So he admits it. And eventually, unsurprisingly, Kohli confessed to Payal's murder. According to his confession, Payal had actually been a call girl and not a maid, and Kohli had grown jealous of her and his boss. He said that he'd wanted a bit for himself. So when his boss was away, he'd called Payal and asked to come over. He claimed that he had some new clients to introduce her to that were connections of Pandit's, so they would be wealthy men. Apparently, Payal came, and when she did, Kohli tried to offer her 500 rupees for sex, but she had laughed at him.
How much is that?
500 rupees is probably about £6.
Wow, okay.
They make a lot of accusations about Payal being a sex worker. I can't confirm it one way or another. Her father and her family say that she was working there as a maid. As we'll go on to see, the police say that she is a sex worker, and Kohli confesses to this. And Kohli says that Pandit used to pay her 25,000 rupees every night that she spent with him. I don't know if that's what she was doing. If she was, her family were incredibly poor. Sex work, unfortunately, has become a way in which young women from the Dalit communities do have to sustain themselves. They have no other choice in lots of regards. But I can't confirm if that is actually the case. Basically, Kohli says that after Payal refused him sex and laughed at him, that he lost it and he strangled Payal to death.
According to Kohli's confession, he then tried to rape Payal's body, but he physically couldn't do it. The police then showed him pictures of the missing children, and Kohli also started confessing to those murders as well. He said that he strangled all of them after luring them into the house, and he would try to rape the bodies and then dismember them, cook them, and eat them. The rest that he didn't manage to eat, he disposed of in the yard and the sewers behind the house. Kohli also talked about a recurring dream he would have, about a lady in a white sari mocking him. And he also said that this dream filled him with rage, and it was when the dream had started that he had begun to have fantasies.
Yeah, they never really sort of delve more into that, and I don't know what he's sort of talking about here. He kind of talks about this woman in a white sari laughing at him, and that being the trigger point for when he started to have these fantasies about wanting to rape and kill and eat children. What relevance that has to things, I don't know. They never sort of dig into it. The only thing I can add to it culturally is that a woman would only really, I know in places like Kerala, women wear white saris for different reasons, but predominantly you wear white saris to funerals or when you are widowed. And this is very old school. It's really not like this now, especially in major towns and cities. But for example, if my granddad were to die, my grandmother would wear white for the rest of her life.
Wow, okay.
So you shouldn't be wearing colour, again, according to Hinduism, if your husband dies. And that's if they don't push you onto his funeral pyre while you're still alive. So just in case anyone doesn't know what I'm talking about, back in the day, if your husband died, they would just push the widow onto his funeral pyre. Because what's the point in you being alive now? Who's going to support you now? So we might as well just fucking kill you. I'm talking hundreds of years ago. You know, that's not something that I've seen happen recently or even heard about on the news, even in the most fucking, you know, rural parts of India. But definitely my grandmother, who lives in rural India, very orthodox woman, absolutely she would believe that that's what she needs to do. But then, you know, I don't know if I've ever talked about this on the show. Really tragically, my cousin, who's only 6 months older than me, she lost her husband a few years ago in a horrible accident. And she wears whatever she fucking wants. And no one tells her not to. And, you know, we share a grandmother. And my grandmother would never tell her not to. So there has been movement. But if he is seeing dreams of an older white woman, which is what he says in the documentary, wearing white, she would be a widow. What relevance that has to anything, I don't know. And why that triggered him to wanting to kill children, I don't know. But nobody has any curiosity to find out.
And on the topic of funeral pyres, I can't remember which episode we were talking about this on, but we were talking about cremation. How, if it's possible to completely burn a human body in a fire, and we've had some crematorium people get in touch with us. No, it is not. It is completely impossible.
Oh, really?
Even in the super duper fire that like crematoriums have, there will be bits like of bone left over, and they're like, they don't look like it's not like a skeleton, but there are bits, and they put them in a big coffee grinder type situation and grind them up and put that into the ashes, and that's what you get. So there is no way you can burn a human body on just like a pit fire.
Just like a pit fire on the beach.
Yeah, exactly. That would leave no remains at all.
That's good to clear that up.
Yeah, so you're welcome. Thank you, all of the funeral industry people who got in touch with us.
I thought you were going to say funeral enthusiasts.
Funeral enthusiasts. Do you remember when we went to that true crime meetup years ago? And we were in this pub and there was this group of lads in there and they were all wearing matching T-shirts. And they came up to speak to us.
Oh, yes.
And they were like, oh, what do you guys say? We're like, oh, well, we do a true crime podcast. It's like a true crime meetup. And they were like, oh, we're undertakers. And one of the undertakers was getting married and they were all on an undertaking stag do. And it was fucking hilarious.
They were. And hadn't one of them, sorry, this is really morbid, but they were telling us at the pub, like, you know, they were the ones informing us. One of them had got Alexander McQueen's body.
Yes, they did say that,
out of his house,
mansion,
bungalow.
They were telling us all sorts of shit about MPs who's been found in wardrobes, autoerotically asphyxiating themselves.
So if you want a good night out, find an Undertaker stag do.
They were extremely good fun.
They really were. It was an odd matchup. It was basically like a true crime meetup full of what you can expect. Young women.
Yeah.
And then just like middle-aged Undertaker, all men.
Yeah, all men. About 15 of them. All wearing matching T-shirts.
It was hysterical.
It was one of the weirdest nights of my life.
Oh, dear.
Once Pandya heard about Kohli's confession, he said that Payal was indeed a sex worker. And he said that he would meet up with her whenever he was in Delhi. But that she'd started to blackmail him and he had told Kohli to get rid of her. He claims that what he meant by that was to pay her off, and he had no idea that Kohli would actually kill her.
There's just so many lies. This was one of the hardest cases I found to research because there are so many lies coming from everybody, including the police, as you will go on to discover. And Pandya, he says all of this about her being a sex worker, blah, 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 after Kohli says it. And the police had been saying this from the start. When Nand Lal, her father, came in to report her missing and they told him the stuff about she'd probably run off with some guy, they then started to spread rumours that she was a sex worker because he was kicking up such a fuss to get people to look the other way. So did Kohli say that of his own accord? Or did the police tell Kohli to say that while they were beating the shit out of him and then he said that as a reason why he had killed her? And then after he says that, suddenly Pandya's also saying the same thing. It's so badly done, everything about this case. So we can only tell you what we have been able to research. But this is a fucking mess, this case. So that's what we know so far, right? Let's talk about who these men actually were. So Kohli, he was born in a rural village in the isolated foothills of the Himalayas in the Almora district of India. His family, like we said, were Dalit, and they had been incredibly poor. Kohli was known as a kid to be quite a shy, nervous, introverted child. He had dropped out of school by the age of just 8, which again is very typical for a Dalit child, unfortunately, especially in rural India. No one expected much of Kohli. And although things, especially in the cities, like I said, are changing a bit now with scheduled castes, like there had been a big push by previous governments to improve their circumstances. But typically, like we talked about, Dalits are left to do the kind of jobs that nobody else wants to do. They do a lot of the grave digging. They do a lot of pyre building. Because again, it seemed like as a low karma job to be handling the dead. Even when we did the interview with Sonia Falero, which if you guys haven't seen, the audio version is available to everybody, video is available to our patrons. In there, Sonia Falero came to talk to us about a book that she had written called The Good Girls, which if you guys haven't read, I would highly recommend. I won't get into it now because it's all in the interview, but she basically talked about how in some parts of rural India, doctors don't want to become pathologists because to handle the dead is, again, it's so crazy that even people who are highly educated will think things like this. It's a low karma job. Again, this isn't widespread. This is predominantly kind of the way of thinking in rural India where it's much more superstitious. They basically said that they didn't have any doctors that were willing to carry out autopsies on these dead children that they found in the book, The Good Girls. So let's just get like the guy who sweeps the streets. And he went to the market and bought some knives and then just had a go at looking inside these bodies. I mean, this is what we're talking about. It's mind-blowing. So that's basically what we're dealing with here. Kohli is living there, struggling for work, as most Dalits would do, especially in rural parts of India. So at the age of just 13 years old, Kohli, along with his brother-in-law, moved almost 500 miles away to look for work in Delhi. And in typical fashion, he lives there for a good while. And then at the age of 30, he returns to his home village to get married. And after his marriage, his wife doesn't come with him because they have they've got work to do. They've got farm handing to do or whatever back in the village. So his wife stays there and Kohli goes back to Delhi and he would send money home whenever he could. Now Shanti, who's Kohli's wife, said that he always treated her very well. In the Karma Killings, they interview Shanti quite a lot, so you can hear it from her herself. And she says that Kohli would go home every 6 months. He doted on her. They had 2 children. He doted on them. She even says that he used to call her every single morning and tell her that he missed her. Seemingly, Kohli's childhood and his married life showed no red flags.
Once in Delhi, Kohli hopped jobs for a while before he landed the role of domestic helper at bungalow D5. And this job was quite the shock for Kohli because his new boss loved nothing more than throwing giant drink and drug-fueled orgies at his house. And Kohli had never seen anything like it.
I think he wouldn't, not even just not seen anything like it, I don't think he would have even contemplated anything like it.
Comprehended that it even existed.
No, this isn't a man who had access to the internet. This isn't a man who had access to even TV, most likely. He just lived in fucking bumfuck nowhere India, completely rural, completely socially, sexually conservative. Conservative isn't even the right word. Repressed.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that a man like Pandey, who was very, very wealthy, travelled a lot, was exposed to everything, and as we'll go on to see, is a massive fucking deviant, in my opinion, would do these kind of things in this house, Kohli would have had no clue. It would have been unbelievable, incomprehensible to him that this was a way that somebody could live their life.
But Pandey, we think, is far more interesting because of the way of the world. He gets a lot less attention than Kohli does. On the surface, Pandey is a respectable, well-to-do businessman. Nicknamed Goldie from his school days, Pandey was always known as a warm and amiable kind of guy. But it seems that it might all just have been for show. Some investigators claimed that Pandey had a disturbed childhood and that his marriage was a failure and a sham. He had all but abandoned his family in Punjab and had been living on his own in Delhi for years. Pandey lived a life of excess and luxury. He loved to drink, buy fast cars and throw his infamous parties. He loved to travel and would regularly fly around the world for business. And in his spare time, apparently, he liked to read about nightmares.
It's never elaborated on anywhere what this means. I don't know. And I left it in because it's just such an odd thing. Not that it's odd to be interested in nightmares, but I want to just build an image in your mind of this guy, right? Pandey, whenever you see him, he's wearing an Argyle jumper, like a golf jumper, with the diamonds on it. That's what he's always wearing. He's wearing a tweed coat and stuff like this. It's very Western in that kind of way. He's living this kind of wealthy bachelor lifestyle and just has left his family in the Punjab and does what he wants in this massive fucking house in Delhi where he just lives on his own, essentially. And then there's just this weird thing about him reading about nightmares all the time. And nobody explains what that is about.
That is bizarre. I still really want to watch that documentary, Nightmare. You were actually in my nightmare last night.
Was I? Was I doing something
No.
troubling?
No.
But I wonder what nightmares that man was having.
Yeah.
Given all the things that he definitely did, allegedly. And is that the reason he was obsessed with them? In my opinion, probably yes.
I've just never even heard about, like, I think, being interested in dreams is something that people will say, but nightmares specifically.
I think if it's only because of the context of everything else I know about him. Anyway, let's not blow my load just yet. Let's keep going. So the psychologist who evaluated Coley and Pandey says in the documentary The Karma Killings that she thought Coley had been driven to kill after coming to Delhi and experiencing all of the sexual craziness going on at Pandey's house. She figures that this awakened something within Coley and gave him the urge to try it for himself. She says, he grew up in a very sheltered situation where these kind of things would never have occurred to him before. But now once he's exposed to it, he has something of a sexual awakening, is her opinion. Why this psychologist never mentions that maybe a man like Pandey, who seems to have had the inclination, appetite, and ability to indulge in his every desire, wouldn't or couldn't want to push things further and further to the extreme to get a kick out of something. Like we've seen time and time again, like we've talked about this before. If you haven't listened to Hunting Warhead, go listen to it. There's also quite a lot of documentaries on YouTube that I've watched about, say, paedophilia versus child sex offenders, and the idea that child sex offenders can typically just be opportunistic sex offenders. Even people who end up watching sexually explicit videos of children being sexually abused on the internet, the reason that some of them have ended up there isn't because they were preferential paedophiles. It's because they have worn themselves out on regular types of porn so much that they have to take it further and further to an extreme to be able to get the same kick. So why the psychologist never even engages in the idea that someone like Pandey, who I think the word affluenza sums him up perfectly, could or would not have gone to the point of raping small children and murdering them. She never even engaged. She just says Coley must have done it because he'd never had been open to sexual experiences before in a free and unrepressed way. And then he must have come here and been like, oh my God, look at what he's doing, just having consensual orgies with all of these women. Maybe I can rape and kill some kids. It's such a bizarre thing that they skirt over Pandey at every opportunity, all of the authorities involved in this. And that's why I didn't like the Karma Killings. And the other psychologists who evaluated Coley and Pandey found that they were polar opposites. Unsurprising, they're polar opposites in every aspect of their lives. Right. But Coley is, much like he was as a child, awkward. He mumbles when he speaks. He never made eye contact with anybody when he's speaking to them. Pandey, on the other hand, he's a businessman. He travels all around the world. He's incredibly outgoing. He's incredibly confident. And he has all of the confidence of a wealthy man.
Give me the confidence of a wealthy man.
Exactly.
A wealthy, privileged man.
Interestingly, there's a test that the psychologist has Coley and Pandey do. She calls it the draw a person test. And she asks them both to do it. And typically what she says happens in, again, the Karma Killings documentary, is that when people are asked to do this, they typically draw a version of themselves. So if you or I were to draw somebody in this test, we would draw a woman in their 30s.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I was like, what would I draw? I was like, definitely draw a woman. It wouldn't even cross my mind to draw a man.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what she says the majority of people typically tend to do. What was interesting here is that Pandey and Coley both drew pictures of young girls. Coley is 36. Pandey is 55.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Again, though, they're like, say it, but then they're not like, hey, Pandey also did this. And she kind of ignores that completely. Again, that Pandey did this. Basically, she says that Coley drew pictures of very young girls. So girls who were maybe 4 or 5. And Pandey drew pictures of girls who were like 18, 19. So like, just out of adolescence. And then she sort of ignores the fact that Pandey does that and then says Coley did this because he was sexually obsessed with small girls.
Right.
But I'm like,
but
so
Pandey
what
just gets a pass.
And like, how can you tell in a drawing how old a girl is? Like, really? If you can tell she's 18, 19, what if he's just drawn a bigger picture of a girl? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, no, that's weird.
Again, the whole documentary, The Karma Killings, I took severe issue with it because they skirt over Pandey consistently.
Right. On the 5th of January, Pandya and Kohli both had extensive narco-analysis tests conducted on them by police. We touched on this method in the Arushi Talwar case that we did last year, but let's revisit it. Narco-analysis is an investigative tool that has been a highly controversial topic for decades. The test tries to put the subject into a hypnotic or semi-conscious state by injecting them with the barbiturate thiopental sodium. This drug depresses the central nervous system and it slows down brain activity. The theory is that in this state, the person's imagination is neutralized, making it harder for the person to lie. But it's flawed and it's highly questionable as well. Several critics have expressed major concerns about the legitimacy of its findings. For example, a person with a high tolerance to drugs or alcohol won't be affected in the same way, but they could easily pretend to be in a semi-conscious state and simply lie. And also, innocent subjects can become highly suggestible and easily led by the people in the room.
And just a reminder that one of Pandya's favourite things to do is to get drunk off his face and take loads of drugs.
Yeah. As we will go on to discover next week, where we have another interrogation situation. I won't give the game away, but there are a lot of similarities between this one and the one we're doing next week. People are suggestible in interview rooms anyway. Mm-hmm. You don't need to be pumping them full of barbiturates to get that result.
But it probably helps.
I'm sure it makes the process a lot quicker. Days to hours, I would imagine.
So when he was under, Kohli began again admitting to the crimes, saying how he had strangled, raped, chopped up and eaten the children. The interview was filmed and, unbelievably, the police released the interview tape of him giving his confession while he's under narco-analysis to a national news outlet.
Yikes.
And it's played on national television before his trial. So that seems fine, right? So obviously people watched and listened to Kohli talking about carrying the body of an 8-year-old girl named Dimple up to the bathroom where he cut her into pieces and then cooked part of her arm and chest. This is the detailed story that he tells, but it's very similar to the story that he apparently confessed to police originally. Needless to say, these videos freaked everyone in India the fuck out. Again, just to put it into cultural context, I think in the West, I wouldn't say we've become desensitized to true crime stories, but it takes a lot for people to be shocked anymore.
Yes, I agree, yeah.
In India, you're starting to see the emergence of TV shows and movies now about procedurals, police dramas, murder mysteries. That's becoming a more popular genre, but it's very, very sanitized. I'm not saying that people aren't morbid there. Of course they are. My grandmother is the reason that I'm morbid, for sure. She's told me horrendous stories when I was a kid. But for people in India to sit and watch on national TV a man like Kohli talking explicitly about getting sexual gratification from necrophilia, because he said that he only ever tried to rape the bodies when they were dead, from chopping up the bodies and from cannibalism, that's just something that as a nation, the mentality of people in India, that's not something that they are prepared for. The idea that one could be sexually gratified by that kind of thing. It's shocking. So yeah, it's a lot that they released this tape. As for what Pandya admitted to during his narco-analysis interview is a lot less obvious, because there was also a tape of his released to the national media, but it was heavily edited. It was very clear to see it was heavily edited. And in these parts, it makes it look like he doesn't know what happened. Because he says things like, when the police ask him, how could you not have known that this was happening in your house? And remember what we said earlier, one of the criticisms of narco-analysis is people who have a high tolerance for drugs and alcohol can easily pretend to be under when they're not. And when he's asked this, he says, I'm not a woman. I don't just go around my house poking my nose into every room to see what's going on. I'm sorry. Let's just quickly address that fact. This man owns this entire house. He lives there on his own. He has Kohli there living, as like we said, a live-in domestic worker. There is not 1 ounce of me that believes that a man like Pandya, with his status level in society, would allow Kohli, a Dalit, and be his domestic worker, free run of the house. There is no way on this planet that that is true. And yet, just to repeat, video heavily edited, huge chunks missing.
The families of the victims knew that the local police were in it up to their necks with Pundir, so they appealed that the case be taken off local police and given to the CBI, or the Central Bureau of Investigation.
Which is like the equivalent of the FBI.
And as political pressure began to build after 6 officers who had been involved in the case were found to have been taking bribes from Pundir, you really couldn't make this up, they were found out and they were sacked. So that, at least is a little bit of good news. And then the Minister of the Interior actually did hand over the case to the CBI.
They only did it after they had absolutely no other choice, because these 6 officers were found out to literally have been taking thousands and thousands of rupees in bribes from Pundir.
And we will go on to discover it just gets more and more depressing as we go on. So yes, it is handed over to the CBI. Yes, they only do it at the last possible moment, and it also doesn't really make that much difference. It doesn't really solve the problem. And that's because on January the 11th, 2007, 2 months after having taken over the case, the CBI cleared Pundir and blamed his quote-unquote psychopathic domestic help, Kohli, for the murders of 19 people. The CBI named Kohli as the only accused, saying that Pundir was guilty only of criminal conspiracy, destruction of evidence, and running his home as a brothel. Those are all quite bad things.
They had to charge him with these things because of the officers who were found to be taking bribes. Basically, they say that Pundir was having these regular orgies at the house, but that he didn't murder anybody. They say that he only ever destroyed evidence relating to the sex parties that he had been running. They even claimed that the proven bribes that Pundir had dished out to the local police was because he had been called in for questioning over the brothel and the sex parties. And he thought it would hurt his reputation as a businessman, so he tried to get out of it. So basically, to get him out of murder, the CBI were like, look, we have to say you did something. Because it's been proven that you've been moving money and paying these police officers bribes. So we have to say something. So the thing we'll say is, everybody already knows you've been doing, sex parties at that house. So let's just say that the reason you paid these bribes was because you were so scared because of these sex parties.
I see.
And because he then says that, he destroyed some evidence in the house relating to the brothel that he was running, they said that's all he'd done. So that's what the CBI essentially claimed to try and get Pundir out of the more serious charge of serial rape and murder. The problem is that the CBI were unable to present any police records of Pundir ever having been questioned or even called in for questioning in connection with charges of running a brothel. So the bribes, what were they really for? I'm guessing probably the 19 bodies that were found in his garden.
One would think.
Mm-hmm. And it just gets worse. At a press conference, then CBI Joint Director Arun Kumar, again, you can meet Arun Kumar in the documentary Karma Killings, and he says that, and this is a quote, this is what he says at the press conference when they basically clear Pundir. They say, except for 1 or 2 cases where Pundir's role has still not been probed, he did not rape or murder the Nithari victims. And that is a quote. And then he goes on to say, he wasn't even aware of the killings by Kohli till the Noida police started digging up the bones at his bungalow. Which makes Pundir sound very dumb indeed, doesn't it? The idea that he was living in this house, and yes, granted, he was away on business a lot, but he was living in this house as like one of his main residences, and that he had absolutely no idea that his man-maid had been killing 19 people in this house. That he had absolutely no idea about this. Makes him sound quite stupid. But the CBI play up Pundir's intelligence when they need to by pointing out that Pundir was highly educated, and he also had the means to get rid of bodies because he had so much money. So if he had murdered all these people, why on earth would he dump the bodies in his own garden?
Oh my God.
Yeah, so he's stupid on one hand, but he's a genius on the other. And he's incredibly wealthy and successful and could have done anything, so why would he have done this? The other important thing to note is the number 19 that we keep saying, that's the number of skulls that they found in the yard and in the sewers. There were upwards of 40 victims that were reported missing, that the police didn't even file reports for. They just weren't linked to the Nithari case because they found no remains for these people. So where the other half of the missing victims, if they are related to this, we can't know for sure that they are related to this case. Like we said, child trafficking in India is a huge problem. But if they were related, maybe he got rid of those bodies. And then he gets lazy and dumps these here. Like, why that is a part of the argument and why they sweep under the rug the idea that Pundir didn't know that this was happening in his house. Again, it's ludicrous. And Arun Kumar is he's fucking joint director at the CBI. He's not some beat cop. It's ludicrous.
Like, I just don't even know what to say.
No.
Because it doesn't sound real.
No.
But it is.
Yeah. And they don't come out and just say there's not enough evidence with Pandya, but there's enough evidence with Kohli, so we're going to pursue this. He comes out and offers an aggressive defense of Pandya.
Mm-hmm.
That is the thing that is the most jarring about it.
And we've seen a lot of killers do this. But actually, when you think about, the argument, obviously, as Sri said, by the police is that why would he just dump all of the bodies in his back garden when he could have done anything to them? He could have shipped them to Timbuktu if he wanted to. He got all his money and clearly has no problem with bribing people. But the thing is, he got away with it for so long. It's hiding in plain sight. Killers do it all the time. Bob Bardella just left people out for the dustman to come and get, for God's sake, and he wasn't rich.
And Dennis Nilsson just buried them under his own fucking floorboards.
Yeah, Dennis Nilsson did exactly the same fucking thing. Like lots of killers, it's not to do with stupidity. It's not to do with anything other than arrogance.
Yeah.
It's, I'm obviously going to get away with this. Mm-hmm. Like Dennis Nilsson, as soon as his body count started to get up, he was like, oh, this is fine. I can just do whatever I fucking want. And obviously Pandya's been able to do whatever the fuck he wanted his entire life. And Arun Kumar and the CBI went on to say that Kohli had murdered all of these women and children when Pandya had been out of the country, or at the very least, not in Delhi. They concluded this by tracking Pandya's phone, and sure enough, in the majority of the 19 disappearances, Pandya was either abroad or somewhere else in India. But the CBI were only ever able to establish the dates of the abductions due to the state of the remains. Accurate dates of death are basically impossible to get your hands on. So what proof is there that Pandya wasn't involved in the murders? Quite literally none. Just because he wasn't there when some of the people were taken, the children went missing, who knows how long the victims were in the house for? It kind of makes perfect sense. When he's sort of away on business, he's like, when I come back, I want 3.
Absolutely. This is held up by the CBI as like aha, we cracked it. You haven't fucking cracked shit. The ones when he's abroad, okay, fair enough, he's got stamps in his passports. The one when he's somewhere else in India, like, you're just locating his phone. They didn't even show evidence for locating the person, like him as a person being there. It's ludicrous. And one of the questions actually is, why were some of the bones so decomposed? Like, yes, India is a hot place, decomposition would definitely happen faster, but some of these victims hadn't been missing that long, and they were in such just bone, and there is again no explanation for that. And they could never establish, with just bones, they couldn't establish the exact date of death. So no one has any idea when these victims were actually killed. So to clear Pandya, based on the fact that he wasn't in the area when the abductions happened, given that the CBI can easily say that Kohli was the one who was doing the abductions, but there is no proof of who did the killings, again, it's ludicrous.
And on top of that, on many of the dates where Pandya wasn't in Delhi when the abductions happened, he was back just a day or 2 later.
Literally, they're like, oh, he was in Australia on the date this child went missing. 2 days later, he's back in bungalow D5. What?
I don't know. I wish I could tell you.
Yeah. So also in court, and this is again absolutely shocking when I read this, the CBI would stand with Pandya's lawyers in court. What the actual fuck? Let's get this clear. The CBI, it's the state that's prosecuting Pandya and Kohli. Like, that's the point. The CBI work for the state. The state works with the victims and the prosecution. The CBI should have been standing with the fucking prosecution. They were standing with the defense, with Pandya's defense. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
No, absolutely none. Absolutely none.
It is mind-boggling what is going on here. I don't even know what to say. So unsurprisingly, Arun Kumar's version didn't really convince many people, especially not the victims' families. The CBI wasn't just pointing the finger at Kohli. Like I said, they were aggressively coming out to defend Pandya. So the question became, why on earth would Kohli confess to these 19 crimes if he wasn't guilty? Or at least if he wasn't solely responsible? Why would he not point the finger at Pandya as well and say that he had been involved? Firstly, as we told you, as the police themselves admitted, he had been tortured by the police at their own admission. Kohli was also a 6th or 7th standard dropout. That means that he was just 8 years old when he dropped out of school. Pandya, by contrast, was a highly educated man, and I don't mean he was just highly educated in a normal sense. He went to one of the most prestigious schools in India, and then following that, he went to one of the most high-ranking prestigious universities in India. This man came from money his entire life. I can't stress that enough. And in his confessions and interviews, Kohli even also always refers to Pandit as Sahib, which means master. It's literally a colonial term. It's what Indians were forced to call like members of the British Raj. Like that is what it means. It means master. And I'm not saying Kohli was a slave because he was obviously being paid for his work because he was sending money home to his family. But the terminology there, the power dynamic, I cannot stress this enough. This isn't just employer-employee. The mentality of people, because also in India, this oppression is so like deeply ingrained. People who are oppressed also feel that way about themselves, that they are lesser than. So Kohli will have believed that about himself.
So the idea that when his master is away, he's going to murder and eat children in his house is kind of ridiculous.
To me, I don't believe that. Calling him Sahib tells you everything you need to know. Kohli would not, in my opinion, and maybe he's so overcome by these urges he couldn't help himself, but I find it hard to believe that Kohli would have behaved that way in his Sahib's house, behind his back. And I don't know, I think, therefore, I don't see how you couldn't argue that Pandit could easily have manipulated and scared a man like Kohli into taking the entire blame for this whole thing. What I find much harder to believe is Pandit and the CBI story that Kohli somehow killed 19 people in that house and kept it all a secret from Pandit. I find that impossible to believe. Even in the most generous telling of that version, the relationship, again, like I said, that Pandit would have had with a man like Kohli, a man that he absolutely would have seen as beneath him, I cannot believe that he left Kohli with full run of that massive house whenever he wasn't there.
And so, when the CBI decided not to file charges against Pandit, 6 family members of the victims decided to do something about it. Sunil Biswas, Karambir, Jebulal, Nandlal, Jatin and Bandana Sarkar and Anil Haldar found a lawyer to take their case for free. And this lawyer was Mr. Khalid Khan.
I love Khalid Khan so much. He takes his case pro bono, and he's tough. He's tough on them. He says, I'll take this case, but if any of you backtrack in court, change your minds, change your stories, because there were payoffs. There were payoffs going around, which we'll come on to talk about. Any of you change your story, I will fucking sue you. And we'll go on to see what happens with that.
And Khan isn't a Hindu name, is it?
No, Khan is a Muslim name.
So would that have given him a bit more of a outside perspective, or not really?
Not really. I mean, anyone who grows up in India would be well aware of this because Hindus are the majority. You know, we're talking 90% plus. But no, Khan would be all too aware of the situation and the statuses at play. And also, even if you strip all that away, Pandit, mega rich.
Sure.
Kohli, poor. And kids, families, poor.
And something else we need to mention about the Indian justice system is that each case is tried separately with its own separate trials. If Kohli was being charged with 19 murders, there would be 19 trials.
Yeah. So each victim would get their own trial. It wouldn't just be, we're trying you for 19 murders.
Fuck me, no wonder nothing ever happens in the justice system.
Oh yeah, there is a massive fucking backlog. An absolute catastrophic backlog in the Indian justice system.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
We know that Mr. Khalid Khan is taking this case for free, and if that's the case, which it is, why didn't all of the families of the missing children get involved?
It is worth mentioning, of course, that a lot of these people are day labourers. So for them to take that much time out of their lives would have cost them the opportunity cost of going to work. And maybe some of them were like, look, it's happened. We're not going to get any justice anyway. We just have to get on with our lives. So I don't want to unfairly scrutinise these people. But it wasn't even 6 families. It was 6 individuals. It's actually only 4 of the victims' actual kin who get involved in pursuing this case. And I think it is worth asking why because of the next bit.
And the next bit is that several of the families were rumoured to have taken payoffs. We can't prove that because obviously it's not going to be an official bank transaction. No one's going to have signed any dotted lines.
No, and it wasn't like an out-of-court settlement. It's it's payoffs.
Under the table, yeah. But according to Jabu, quote, people who had never even had bikes suddenly had cars. I don't think it takes a genius to deduce that those payoffs were not coming from Kohli.
Yeah, exactly. Follow the money. Here you can't because it's obviously under the table, but it is very interesting that this happens. And again, I'm not going to criticize these people for taking that money. They have nothing. They have less than nothing, some of these families. Yes, their child has been murdered and it's horrendous, but they would already know that they're not going to get justice. If they're lucky, maybe something would happen. But why sacrifice the opportunity cost of going to work every day? These are people who are paid cash in hand on a daily basis, who've got other children. I'm not going to scrutinize them for taking that money, but where is the money coming from? And why would somebody who is innocent be paying that money? Especially when the CBI is already not even wanting to go after you.
And when Pundir's son, who has done a lot of the Pundir family's comms after his father's arrest, when he was asked about why so many of the victims' families had retracted their cases, he just said that he had sat down and talked to them, and that they had decided not to pursue the case because of the evidence that he had shown them. So basically he's saying, we had a nice civil conversation, we sat down at a table, and I gave them the logical reason why they were wasting their time.
And they all agreed with me that my father must be completely innocent, and they retracted their cases. Fucking hell.
Jesus Christ.
These people really are living on another planet.
And this is the 2000s. Like, this isn't like...
No, fucking no. This is like not mid 2000s, because, you know what I mean? Like, it's in like 2006 to 2000 and now that it's happening. And if you do want to hear from Pundir's son, watch the Karma Killings. He's fucking all over it. Again, I don't know whether he knows that his father did it or not. And maybe he is arguing with all sincerity. And bribes, to the Western ear, it sounds like, why would you do that if you weren't guilty? In India, bribery is like it's like breathing. People expect to pay a bribe for everything. If you're driving around, the police will stop you for no reason. They'll be like, show me this, show me that, show me the registration papers for this car. You were going too fast. And you can't see me, but I'm doing a handout signal. Like, give me some money. And then I'll let you go. It's corruption is the name of the game. Bribery is like the universal language in India. So again, I guess we do have to say that why Pundir is paying is very suspicious, especially when the CBI aren't going after him. But I could see that his son maybe thinks this is just how we deal with things. So first up for the Nithari cases, because remember there's going to be a trial for every victim, was the trial of Rimpa Haldar. Now, again, people might be thinking, why haven't I read out the names of all 19 victims? I don't know them. We only know the names of the victims whose cases have gone to trial so far. And even some of those, it's not obvious. And this is because, like we talked about with the case of Jyoti Singh, who was the Nirabai Delhi rape case, in Indian law, there is a lot of protection given to families and victims about the name not being released to the press. And this is, again, here in the West, we have this idea of name the victims, name the victims. In India, there is a thing of like, why are you dragging this person's name through the fucking media? You're humiliating that family further. So it's a different cultural aspect. So we'll just name the people who have chosen to be named. But like I said, first trial, Rimpa Haldar. And Khalid Khan, although he knew that it was going to be tough, was quietly confident about the family's chances. Jatin and Bandana Sarkar, who were the parents of a victim named Pinky Sarkar, had some evidence that the CBI seemed to have buried. And this is just like, when I had to read this like 5 times because I was like, this cannot be real. It's fucking unbelievable. So according to Jatin Sarkar, on the day that the police had raided bungalow D5, remember we said that a lot of the residents of Nithari had actually broken into the property on the same day that the police were raiding it. He had been there, and he had heard Circle Officer Dinesh Yadav interrogate Kohli and Pundir the day that the local police had searched the house first. And apparently, Pundir had confessed there and then to the murders, to this officer Yadav. And Jatin said that he had heard him confess. Pundir said, according to Jatin, that he would send Kohli out to go and find the victims. And the victim type that he asked for, because remember, some of the victims are children, 4 of them were grown women, he said would depend on the mood that he was in or the type of guests coming to their next party. Pundir would then rape the victims, pass them around his guests, and then give them back to Kohli, telling him to do whatever he wanted, but then to kill them afterwards and get rid of the body. So this is what Jatin said he heard Pundir confess to Officer Yadav. Now, this statement on its own wouldn't exactly stand up in court, especially when it's a murder trial. But the officer Yadav had apparently recorded these confessions by Pundir in his police officer's notebook that night that he had been there. Yadav's constable, and again, this is all according to Jatin, apparently Yadav's constable had then told him, you should go and make a photocopy of that page just to be safe. And this constable had actually been the one to take the notebook. He said, I'll do it. Take the notebook, and went and got a photocopy. Jatin then said that this constable then came back to the house and gave a photocopy of that page to him, to Jatin. And apparently when he did this constable looked scared and he looked, quote, disturbed. And apparently he said, keep this safe because it was, quote, an important piece of evidence that would help you when the time comes.
The CBI and the local UP police didn't know that the Sarkars had this evidence, but they did know that Jatin had been eyewitnesses to the confession. And guess what? After numerous intimidating visits to his house, backed up by neighbours who saw scary men come and go in the middle of the night, Jatin was eventually found dead on the 1st of September 2007. He was made to look like he drowned, but the massive gash on his forehead and the numerous broken bones in his body told another story. But even this didn't deter his wife, Bandana, though. She had safely kept the photocopy of the notebook page. So when Khan asked the CBI where Yadav's notes were from that night, from the night of the confession, they just gave him a piece of paper with some scribbles on it that had been dated for the night of the confession, and they claimed that Yadav hadn't actually taken his notebook with him that day, so that's why the notes weren't in his official notebook, they were on a piece of paper. But Bandana Sarkar's photocopy, that we know that she's kept safely all this time, was in Yadav's writing. And this is the real nail in the coffin. It even had a page number in the bottom corner, and that page number just so happened to be missing from Officer Yadav's diary. So they just ripped it out, thrown it away, and presented Khan with a trumped-up piece of evidence that they just made up. So essentially, the CBI, just realising that the jig was up, they just threw Yadav under the bus, pinning all of the intimidation on the victims' families, and even the alleged murder of Jatin on Yadav. But no case was ever brought against Yadav, and to this day, he's still serving as a UP police officer. So nothing really happens.
No, they were just like, fuck, we got caught in a massive lie. Let's just blame him, say he was acting as a rogue officer, but then we don't have to convict him anyway. Because then he might bring a case against us. So we'll just leave him. It's fucking ridiculous. So thanks to this evidence of the photocopied page from Yadav's notebook, and, well, everything else glaringly obvious about this case, even though the CBI didn't want to bring charges against Pandey, because they still don't want to do it after this page from the notebook is revealed, the court indicted Pandey anyway, because they'd seen enough. And in court, the pair, so Pandey and Kohli, stood in severe contrast, reflecting firstly their enormous power differential between them, but also their demeanour. Pandey looked calm and composed, like he knew that he was going to be fine, like he was going to be safe.
He's been fine his whole life.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would it change now?
No. Kohli, on the other hand, was wide-eyed and frantic looking. And eventually, on the 13th of February 2009, both Kohli and Pandey were found guilty of the murder of 14-year-old Rimpa Haldar and sentenced to death. When he heard this, Pandey fainted.
Wow.
Yep. And in India, this was a real, watershed moment to some degree. Because for India to see a poor Dalit families building a case against a rich man like Pandey and taking it all the way to court and getting a death sentence for him was incredible. What I would like to say is that for a lot of people, especially, people weren't like, oh my God, look at these Dalits doing. They were good. They were fucking good. People supported this. And these families, although lawyer Khan had worked for free, still had spent so much money fighting for justice. Like I said, they were labourers who were paid by the day, so the opportunity cost in literal monetary terms of them not going to work and being sat in court instead was enormous. And also, tragically, most of them were illiterate, but they still had to photocopy every single document and keep it safe. And just the photocopying costs alone had run into the thousands for these families. But finally, it seemed like justice was going to be served and it was all going to be worth it. But in September that same year, so 2009, the Indian justice system decided to slap back, and at an appeal in the Allahabad High Court, Pandey was acquitted of the crime on the grounds of a lack of evidence. But Kohli's death sentence was confirmed. This is the thing you have to also understand about the Indian justice system or Indian legal framework in general. A confession will do. Kohli had confessed, Pandey had never confessed. So in the eyes of no other evidence being there, even though the bodies were found in the fucking literal garden, the confession was enough.
And It still isn't over. Coley still has a roller coaster heading straight in his direction. The courts seem to go into hyperdrive trying to get him executed because often with high-profile cases, in this country, in India, in many countries across the world, I would hazard a guess at all, when there is political pressure, the justice system and the police just want to get it done as soon as possible. And sometimes they kind of don't care who it is. It didn't really make sense wanting to kill him so quickly because there are still 18 other murder trials to deal with, some of which Pandya was also in the frame for. So given that Coley still had numerous charges against him, and that he was the only eyewitness in cases against Pandya, why were they rushing through his execution? It seemed quite unusual, especially when you take into account that they kept moving the date of the intended execution, and that they kept it a secret, something that is only really a thing in India when a prisoner is convicted of terrorism, which is not really, at all, in any way, shape or form, what he's convicted of. But Coley had been appealing his execution with the help of some new lawyers. He now claims, with the help of his new legal team, that he covered up for Pandya, and that all he had ever done was lure children into the house. But even then, there are still a lot of holes in the case. For example, 3 bodies seem to have gone mysteriously missing. The police claim that there were 16 murders, despite initially reporting they discovered 19 skulls. And also, other leads or motives have barely been looked into beyond the point of Coley being a serial killer. It's really pixie-choosy. It's a cherry-picking, if I've ever seen it.
It makes little to no sense. So originally they say find 19 skulls, there are 19 murder cases, but 3 of the bodies have never been accounted for at all. Don't know where they've gone. So obviously in those cases, they'll just say there's no evidence, there's not even a body, throw it out of trial. Like, what is going on? None of it makes any fucking sense. And if you are confused by any of this, this is literally the best that we could do. This case is a complete fucking mess.
Because everyone's lying.
Everyone's lying. So yeah, like Hannah said, other motives for what could have happened here were completely ignored, including other highly probable motives such as, for example, organ harvesting was never even looked into. And this was despite the fact that the house, which backed onto bungalow D5, was that of a doctor named Navin Chowdhury, who had been under police suspicion in 1998 in connection with an alleged kidney racket in his hospital. Never looked into. Also, the interesting, because you might be thinking, like, what's that? It's just a coincidence. Why are all the torsos missing? All they ever found were legs, arms, and skulls. The torsos were never found. If you're going to harvest organs, that's where the organs are.
Yeah, right, that's the bit you want.
That's the bit. Never looked into. Never ever looked into. And also, sex trafficking was not properly investigated at all, even though the police made links between Pandya and sex rings by Pandya's own fucking admission, because he tried to get out of the murder by saying that's all he was involved in. And finally, if Coley was the sole culprit, and if the investigation into the serial killings really is complete, then why were children going missing in Nithari long before Coley arrived? And why are children in the area still going missing regularly today? And why are the police still avoiding registering these cases? Because that's exactly what's happening.
I don't know. I have no answers for any of those whys.
There are honestly some incredible journalists who have done great work on this. When I say this case isn't talked about enough, I mean like by some of the bigger newspapers. But there are some smaller newspapers, which I'll link below, who are doing incredible investigative work. A sting operation done by a paper called Teleka was the way that the bribery came out. Like, there are some journalists who are really following up hard on this, but there's only so much you can fight against a system like this.
Evidenced by the fact that Pandya now lives as a free man in Chandigarh, the capital of the state of Punjab. Since he was released, reports have leaked that when the police raided Pandya's house, they found bottles of vintage wine, expensive golf clubs, fancy furniture, and also laptops full of sexually explicit images of children, including pictures of Pandya actually abusing children himself. But if these do really exist, they haven't publicly surfaced, surprise, surprise. It's also been alleged that he paid bribes to officers before, when suspicions had been raised previously about his involvement in the disappearance of children in the very same area. And he had quashed the reopening of historical cases of missing children in Chandigarh. I know that generally, to keep the heat off ourselves, we tend not to say people who have been acquitted or cleared or maybe not even taken to trial at all definitely did it, but he definitely did it.
There's just no way in my mind that Pandya didn't do this.
It's appalling.
It's truly, truly appalling. I mean, you put all of the pieces together, he fits the profile. Like, again, I'll reference Hunting Warhead. If you guys haven't listened to it, go listen to it. It's a terrible name for a podcast because nobody knows what it's about, but it's so good. And it's basically about a group of police officers and a hacker bringing down the biggest child sexual exploitation website on the internet called Child's Play. And on there, they talk about the users and the producers. And Pandya, to me, fits all the hallmarks of a producer. He has access to hundreds of children, literally on his doorstep, who he can take, do anything to, and no one will do anything. No one will give a fuck what happened to those children except their families. And he can abuse them in this house that he just lives on his own. If his wife and kids were there as well, I'd be like, oh, how could he get away with it? They're fucking hundreds of miles away. He can do anything. Total free reign. Selling indecent images of children on the internet. Like, he's so wealthy. I just don't believe that this wasn't a part of his diverse revenue portfolio and something that he just fucking loved doing. I know, allegedly, but how... This is why I didn't like Karma Killings. They really just tried to be balance, and they just don't make any, point anything too hard at the fact that there are so many fucking holes in the fact that Pandya... They just never come out and say it. And I'm like, are you serious? Following his acquittal, he moves back to Chandigarh, like you said. Someone set fire to Bungalow D5. And a lot of the protesters who were outside the house regularly, they also turned up at court every single day to try and attack him. And I was like, fair enough. Not that I'm saying the police shouldn't have stopped them. Obviously, they should keep defendants safe. But
I think it shows, people were fucking angry.
People were furious because they fucking knew he was not going to go to jail for this. He has been told by the courts that he's not allowed to give any interviews about this, which I'm sure he's not particularly keen to do anyway. But he's living his life. And the ending of Karma Killings, again, made me so sick. It's just, he's not allowed to speak. So they're just in his house filming him. He's wearing a little fucking tweed suit and an Argyle jumper and whatever. And he just walks out of his very nice house onto the street, just walks down the road, and they're just filming him. And I'm like, fuck off. Fuck off. So anyway, somebody burnt down Bungalow D5. Well, they didn't really burn it down. They set fire to it. Now it's just kind of stood there as a bit of a husk of a building. It looks really ominous. And of course, the locals of Nithari are convinced that they can see and hear the ghosts of the many victims who were brutalized inside. And try as he might, Pandya just can't seem to sell the place, which he's been trying to do for several years.
I mean, you'd need an estate agent that was also a superhero and an angel and a demigod to get rid of that.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere, though I think he'll be just fine.
If anything, it's a hole in his portfolio that I'm quite glad is there.
Yeah, and Kohli, well, he's been in prison ever since 2006. As of 2021, actually, he stood trial yet again, but he was acquitted of that one. Again, it's 19 individual cases. They have more evidence for some than they do for others, apparently. But again, it feels weird to me because if he had killed one person, then he kills all of them. But that's not how the justice system works there. And he now defends himself because
Jesus,
this is a man who dropped out of school age 8. And I don't know, even if you think Kohli did this, he needs to be in a hospital, not on death row.
No.
And that's not just because I'm saying he's mentally ill because of what he's done is so extreme. When you hear him speak, he is not a man who looks well. And I don't know if it's the stress of this case or whether because he actually did it. I don't know. But the whole thing is completely fucked up. And there you go, guys. That is the story of the Nithari child killings. I don't know. Check out the documentary, see what you think. But the whole thing is a mess, and that's what you need to know, basically. So yeah, thank you for listening. That was quite a long one. If you would like more Red-Handed, then come over and check us out on patreon.com/redhanded, where we do Under the Duvet, we do In the News every single month. We do lots of extra content that is over there. You can also check out our brand new podcast called Sinister Societies, which is exclusively on Spotify.
And the #1 podcast in the Scotsman last week.
Thank you, Scotsman, for that. Yeah, basically, Hannah and I talk about all sorts of weird, insidious organizations that are basically cults that operate as if they're legitimate businesses. Recently, we covered Nexium. We also covered Charles Manson's links to the Beach Boys. I was going to say the Boogaloo Boys. That's something completely different. And, Tony Alamo and how he made jackets for Michael Jackson and was also a cult, etc. Go check it out.
Ad infinitum.
Exactly.
It's fun. It's really, really good fun. So hop on over to there. And we are now in January last year.
Yeah.
This year. January this year.
This year, yeah.
But we're nearly in December, so well done.
This is true.
So thank you ever so much to our patrons, Matthew Morley, Sky Strehler, Hannah Lloyd, Alicia Druid, Leighton Wilson, Zoe Sleater, Sarah Mershmere, Lucy Tracy, Gordana Baljakis, Kate Winkler, Erin Nevin, Kelly Arnold, Matthew Oakley, Brittany, Alex Cook, Sawyer Treffinger, Elizabeth Michael, Michelle maybe, Todd, Casey Walls, Hannah Ratcliffe, Heather Lewis, Elizabeth Moreno, Cynthia Tripp, Jinlin Lee, Amy McNeil, Sally Jones, Maria Slocum, Louise Westwood, Caitlin Smith, Cass, Eloisa Nash,
Beth Farrar, Rihanna Head, Sean Lankin, Rosa Roma, Millie Davis, Whitney, Catherine Oakes, Alexis Coleman, Phoebe Ashbolt, Georgia Welburn, Jules Foreman Vaus, Kate Granfield, McKenna Struntz, Emily Sable, Lucy Wiley, Laura, Ariana Sarita, Alice Last, Natasha Berg, Brianna Kelleher, Laura Lewis, Naomi Kavanagh, Cecilia, Carrie Doolittle, Alison Farn, Tracy Wyrick, Daniel Craig, Roll For It, Kat Denos, Morgana Cameron, Lydia J, Terry Gibby, Tina Henriksen, Kim Strathen, Hannah Murphy, Melissa Huntley, Amber Ward, Dora Rector, Rachel Hughes, Emma Thompson, Caroline Grace, Janine McDonald, Storm Hewlett, Molly Bond, and Sam Klasshorst. Sorry. But thank you anyway.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. We love you. We will buy you presents in the next life. See you next time for something else.
Bye.
Bye.